Omnia, thank you so much for the invite. It's a real honour to present. So, as you said, I'm presenting today actually on my PhD work and the things that are coming out of that. So broadly, it's interpreting the phonetic variation of discourse features and trying to look at forensic speaker comparison. So I'll make some definitions of those things as I go. And yeah, so if you see this reference to White Rose, that was the people who funded my PhD. So my PhD was funded by the UK Research Institute. And I just want to start by saying a huge thank you to my supervisors, Paul Fowkes and Vincent Hughes, who without them the project really wouldn't have happened, but also to Chloe Diskin-Holdaway, who I collaborated with on some work looking at and Justin Lowe, who's done some excellent work in providing some scripts for the work you're going to see. Okay, so broadly, this is the research question. And I'll break down the different elements of why it's an interesting question to ask, but how can we use the phonetic variation of discourse features? So the way that frequent words vary in pronunciation, can that aid the task of forensic speaker comparison? These kind of sub-questions emerged out of that. I think every PhD and really every project comes with a series of questions that are related. And for me, it was how do the segments in these features align with phonological categories, so broader phonology, the broader sound system in place. And then thirdly, how do these features vary according to their pragmatic function? And does that have an interplaying effect? And just spoiler alert, it does. There is an effect of the function of these things and how well that makes them perform in forensics, potentially. And if you want to read more of what I'm saying and might be more coherent than me at the end of the semester, but my papers are there, you can read them. A couple of them are on the way, hopefully coming out soon, and the top 3 there are already out. So you can look at some of this work in more detail if you want to learn about the methods or the questions that I'm asking as well. But again, as Omnia said, if there's questions throughout, I'm more than happy to take questions at any point. Okay, so forensic speaker comparison, I'm sure during the course that you're on, you will be aware, but it is the comparison between recordings made by an unknown criminal and a known suspect. Typically in the UK, but internationally, this has in the past been a disputed sample and a known sample. And often that is from a recording made at the scene of a crime, or someone fleeing a crime, or somebody maybe making a threatening phone call. So often it's a phone recording, not always, but it often is. So let's say someone has robbed a bank and they're fleeing the bank and they've made a phone call to get help, to get someone to pick them up and drive them away. And then the task of the analyst is to compare that recording with a recording of a suspect. And usually that is in a police interview room, not always, but usually it's a known person sat, we know who they are, and they're being recorded speaking in that environment. So you have one sample disputed or questioned, one sample that is known. And to do this task, to kind of compare between those two samples, there's this idea of features. Now, mostly people in my field rely on segmental, so vowel or consonant realizations, perhaps measurements of those realizations, so formants, maybe center of gravity, durations, voice onset time, so acoustic measurements of those as well. Increasingly suprasegmental, so measurements of pitch or pitch range, speech rate or voice quality. And then there's this other category of lexico-grammatical, and that can cover choice of words, but it can also cover localized grammar and its fluency behavior. A lot of this is related to perhaps accent or dialect features. So lexico-grammatical might be, I'm from the north of the UK, so I might say A up instead of hello. That might be that kind of thing. Disfluency is more where people trip up and, well, I'm doing it now, pausing, those kind of things. That's where I'm kind of basing a lot of my stuff, is in this higher order choice of things, but combining that. And generally these features that we're looking for, they need to be variable between speakers, but consistent within an individual's speech. So they need to be separating people out, but you want features that people are going to say the same. Now I'm going to give an example in a moment of that. You might imagine a formant plot like this. two features separating people out, nice and separate, but also people are quite consistent. I'll come back to that concept in a second, but the requirements are, as I say, variable between speakers, consistent. They also should be easy to measure, and ideally that would be easy to explain as well, because typically the people receiving these reports they're not linguists, so they need to be understandable features you've analysed. So juries in the UK, but also judges or magistrates, police, legal professionals need to understand the analysis you've done. They need to be robust in transmission, potentially across different types of recording, resistant to disguise, and frequent in speech. And that was the basis for me looking at discourse features many years back when I first looked at this for my master's thesis. Can we look at the most frequent words, and can those offer some weight in a comparison task? Now, I'm going to use a quick visual example to explain this consistency and variableness or variability. Imagine that you've been presented with a picture of someone at the scene of a crime. The criminal has been captured on a CCTV footage. And again, you have the suspect later on, a picture of them. And this is one way I kind of explain this concept broadly. You might visually see, okay, well, the criminal has long hair, a tattoo, a scar, a mustache. The suspect has glasses, a hat, a mustache, but it's a darker mustache. But some of the features, visually at least, are not very consistent. It would be pretty easy for the suspect to have put on a hat and glasses. So that's not a very consistent feature. We change our clothes every day. It's not a hugely consistent thing. Equally, you might change a shirt, you could change your hair, and suddenly you're left with things that are less consistent, more consistent, such as a tattoo or a scar. Now, that's what we're looking for in the voice, with things that can't be changed very easily or don't change based on scenario. People who have a tattoo or a scar visually, that is quite a consistent feature, and it's also quite unique. How many people have a butterfly tattoo on their arm? I don't know that many who would necessarily. That becomes quite a unique identifier. We're looking for aspects of the voice that aren't changeable based on context or changeable based on time of day, but are consistent, but also things that are unique. And the interest of using frequent things, because unlike a visual thing, the voice is all about, well, the things that we say will change depending on where we are. So you might have a recording and you might be looking at the trap vowel or the a vowel. I'm just referring to lexical sets there. And you might have L, and those both might be in both recordings. Those are two good variables for English where you could look at the way someone says ul and the way someone says a, like bat. And that could be a feature that is in both recordings. But it might be that one of your recordings has the straps vowel. So in that recording, they say straps and butts. But in the other known recording, the suspect recording, there might be none of it. Equally, the suspect might say price, but he might not say, well, there might not be that in any of the criminal recordings. Or there might be a bit of the, so like the word think or thing, that might be a feature that's present in a suspect recording, but not the other one. So it's not that frequent features are meant to be better at separating people out necessarily. That's the question of my research. It's just that the more frequent they are, the more likely you're going to have them occurring in both recordings. So that was the beginning point. Can we look at really frequent things, and how are these really frequent things distributed across the variability between speakers and consistency within someone's speech? So why discourse features? I'm looking at yeah, and just particularly today, I'm going to refer a bit to like as well. I'm referring to these as discourse pragmatic features. There's a lot of literature which refers to them in many, many different ways. But generally, they're just syntactically optional, multifunctional, and often organized discourse. And there's lots of interesting work around them, and they're very frequent in speech. In English, yeah and just are the 7th and 26th most used words in a relatively recent corpus. And for police interviews, the word yeah is very relevant, because if someone might not be saying a lot of detail, they might give what we call a no comment interview, but they could say yes and no, etc. That's part of the thinking there. Now, typically, the idea of what I'm doing here is combining a couple of levels of features. Typically, I mentioned people think about segmental, suprasegmental. So you could look at a phrase like just stop and break down every segment. You could also look at the suprasegmental and think about maybe it's produced with creaky voice, that's voice quality, just stop. But could we look at the word holistically? So what I'm doing is taking measurements from each segment and duration measurements, and also considering its placement in the term. So I'm kind of combining a higher order thing of thinking about the use of the words, but also looking at various measurements from that single word and combining it together in analysis. That's part of what I'm doing here. And discourse features are helpful, at least the ones I've chosen, because they do occur in different contexts that could be helpful, and they're very frequent. There isn't a lot of research generally into how these features vary phonetically, which led to one of my other questions I mentioned at the start. So predictions around whether they have multiple functions, whether they might have changed over time in meaning, but also how frequently they're spoken in context. So the word yeah, as a brief example, when it is used at the start of a term, and when it's used to offer some kind of opinion or assessment on a prior term, it tends to be longer in duration and higher in intensity. And I'll play some examples later on. Freestanding backchannel yeah, when you are responding to someone saying a long narrative, but you're not taking the turn. Yeah, if I was in the room with you, you might be doing one of these. Yeah, kind of listening along. They are shorter and lower in intensity. When people say yeah in a question response, it tends to be shorter as well. And when yeah does not take a turn, it tends to be much more creaky. There's a potential confounding issue here, which I'll return back to at the end, but words can be, ideally we want a word just to be a single thing. We want to look at yeah as a feature and not have to worry about the subsets of its function. But if, as some of this literature suggests, yeah has a distinct realization, it's produced in a very different way, depending on its meaning, then you might need to compare response yeah with response yeah and not compare response yeah with backchannel yeah. So understanding how the effects of the function of these words affect the pronunciations is very useful as well. And I'll touch on that throughout. Again, these implications as well of how do words align with phonology. Some writers in usage-based phonology think about words being as vehicles for language change. But there's been some recent work that's been really interesting and quite challenging to see that some very, very frequent words don't align with phonological counterparts. So, for example, you might predict that the word it would be produced with a much more centralized or even just removed vowel or really short vowel compared to the word sit or fit. So that's what we call the kit vowel, but phonologically it's a single vowel in English. In Australian English, the use of it is very distinctive compared to the use of kit. And in Australian and New Zealand Englishes, the production of just is very distinctive and separate from the vowel strut. So the relationship between these words and their broader categories seems to be quite distinctive. So a sub-question here is, can we treat the pronunciation of a frequent word as equivalent to pronunciation of an infrequent word? And that is a broader thing, which I'm kind of drawing and thinking about in some of this work. More on the phonetic and forensic level, though, filled pauses have been found to perform very well. Although filled pauses are not exactly discourse features, they are functional discourse organizing items. They're not linguistically, you can't say what does it mean in the same way you can with the word just, but looking at Cooper measurements of these tended to do very well to separate speakers. So was better than and actually casework in the UK and internationally seems to use filled pauses quite a lot to aid speaker comparison task. Other work has been done by Phil Rose and someone called Elliot in the past. They have both looked at hello, okay, the F words and yeah in casework. Phil Rose used F2 and F3 dynamics in a particular case that he talks about. And he found that just looking at the measurements from the yeah, from yes, was quite strong. And so there's some indication that these words might actually be good for the task. A more recent paper by Phil Rose and Bruce Wang looked at Cantonese. So they looked at Tayat They took measurements from the vocalic segment. They found it was a bit of a weaker discriminant, but had quite low error rates. So that could be used in a case combined with other features and perhaps contribute to a case, was their thinking with that. So we have a rationale for using these features. And let me just briefly mention the methods that I undertook. So I'm talking about just and yeah here. They were all my case studies across a few different aspects of my thesis. So I looked at just and I holistically took measurements from the vowel form midpoints, durations of each of the segments, but I also took center of gravity measurements from the fricative, which broadly tell us where the energy was located in the fricative, and relating that to the tongue. So a high center of gravity would be related to more of an S-like sound, but a low center of gravity would be more of an esh kind of sound, as much as you can hear that across teams. And I took formal trajectories from yeah, because it was really hard to segment out the yeah from the eh. I undertook likelihood ratio testing, and that was used to assess the within between speaker variation. If you don't know what likelihood ratios are, they're quite a standard forensic stats method, and it's balancing the typicality and the similarity. We're kind of balancing two questions: were they the same speaker or were they different speakers? And that's often expressed as similarity over typicality. I use something called multivariate kernel density. I'm happy to ask questions about that later on if you are interested. I won't go into the granular detail of it here, but essentially that involves splitting the data into three to kind of replicate a real casework scenario. So I didn't actually have people on the phone and people in a police room. I had one set of recordings, so I had to split that data set into three to allow comparisons across speakers and between speakers. I replicated each test with different groupings as well, because that's found to be necessary in forensic work. And these two numbers are used to test essentially how well a system is performing, but how well a measurement I'm taking from a single feature is performing. So I need a low equal error rate. So that's about how many errors a system's making, and a low cost log likelihood ratio. So you'll see the figures EER and CLLR a couple of times throughout. The only thing you need to know about them, though, is that the lower the figures are, the better the system. Basically, you want few errors, and you don't want the system to accidentally say this speaker and this speaker were the same person if they weren't the same person. You also don't want them, you don't want to say speaker A and speaker B are different people if they were actually the same person. And then you also don't want huge errors. You don't want errors whereby actually these measurements are very, very, very different, but the system is getting confused. So the measurements of how good the system is performing and separating speakers out. So the first study I'll talk about is just. So I looked at just in a corpus of Southern Standard British English speakers. This was stimulated police interviews, so somewhat relevant to the forensic context. I extracted about 1,200 tokens, so quite a lot of tokens from the data. It was very frequent. That's a comparable frequency to the general corpus I mentioned earlier, so it's still a very frequent feature. There's a lot of vowel elision, but still a good amount of about 1,000 tokens that I looked at here to look at the vowels. I did have to change the numbers of speakers that I used for each different test, but that meant that I had at least 6 tokens for each speaker. Okay, as I mentioned, I took word and segment durations. I measured the vowel midpoint, both the F1, F2, and F3, but I also measured center of gravity from the 2 fricatives and just whenever they were present. I took measurements of just, but I also took measurements of strut, which is the vowel most closely related to just for the Southern speakers. They might pronounce it as just. So I thought I would look at the vowel and see how is that vowel performing separately from the word. And I also looked at the vowel in as I mentioned before, filled pauses are very good in forensic speaker comparison, so it's a known good feature. Here we have my results for just. So this font plot shows every single diamond there is a single token. So all 1,000 tokens plotted out. And we see I've just superimposed shapes showing generally where people are producing different vowels. So I mentioned strut So just isn't really overlapping with strut. It's not sounding very much like an ah as much in this data set. It was overlapping a little bit with the way people produce as a or an but I also measured kit. I mentioned the New Zealand paper. I didn't do testing on kit for speaker comparison, but I found that people were overlapping just with kit quite a lot. So the way people pronounce just was a bit of a gist. So I'll play you 4 different types of just that I was finding.
Just.
So that's quite
Just.
kit-like. Then we have some just so a little bit more open.
Just.
So a little bit more like an there. Some of them were still close, but a bit further back in the mouth.
Just.
And then finally, some that were a little bit strut-like, but not entirely.
Just.
And those 4, actually, if you just focus on the vowel,
Just.
they actually sound.
Just.
Let's go play them all again.
Just.
They sound quite separate, and those are actually 4 different speakers. So those were the 4 speakers that had the highest and lowest F1 and F2 measurements. So they are the periphery speakers, those that had the kind of most extreme measurements for just, but you can hear that there is some separation between them. So a wide variety of vowel pronunciations, but those seem to separate the speakers pretty well. How did that work with my likelihood ratio testing? It worked pretty well. So F1, F2, and F3 estimates. This plot is just showing how is just performing, and it's the same measurements and the same speakers for F1, F2, F3 measurements from just, from strut, and from Remember, the lower the better, hence my huge green arrows. We have the purple box, which shows the red dot for just, and the green triangle for strut. Generally, just was performing in a similar way to There's a bit of a difference, like just was having a few more errors, perhaps, but generally it was close to The distance there is quite small, particularly for CLLR, whereas strut was performing far worse. So we know that is good, just performing quite similar to So just in some ways is quite a good discriminant, a speaker discriminant in this data set. So that's very positive. We know is good, just is performing in a similar way to If we now try to combine other elements of just, so I've looked at the vowel there, what if I added in the durations of each of the segments? So here I have this red dot again, representing the F1, F2, and F3 measurements. And each other shape here is showing what happens to my performance if I added in another measurement. So if I add in vowel duration, which is the purple box, that results in a lower EER and a lower CLLR. So that means that adding vowel duration improves the performance. Adding anything else is a mixed picture. So adding J duration and adding the S duration seems to reduce CLLR, increase EERs. It's kind of not a clear picture, but that difference there between the dot and the box shows that actually just F1, F2, and F3, you improve how well this separates speakers out if I also add the measurement of the vowel duration. Now for the center of gravity measurements, adding the measurement of center of gravity from the S of the word seems to improve the performance. Adding anything from J doesn't seem to improve the performance. So we see a reduction in errors and a reduction in CLLR just by adding the S center of gravity. So what if we combine these features together? This is where my research it felt a lot more like a just working spreadsheets at this point, but combining the features together offered some marginal improvements. So here I have the dot, and here I have what happens if you add S center of gravity, vowel duration, and if you added everything together. So adding vowel duration does improve performance. Adding S center of gravity improves performance. Adding both together, yes, it does improve performance as well. It's not the clearest picture, but essentially you can use these extra measurements to improve how just can be used to separate speakers out. The way you're reducing just, multiple measures from that single word can perform better than just a single vowel measurement. But I want to underline that these differences are very small. I've kind of zoomed in the axes here So 0.6, 0.1, 0.8. These differences are all within a 0.2, 0.05, sorry, difference from each other. So it's quite a small difference. So that even though it's an improvement, it's quite a minimal improvement. The best performing model, if you like, or the best performing combination was looking at F1, F2, and F3 and S central gravity measurements. So just an interim conclusion there, just is performing better than the vowel strut, and it's performing in a similar way to It was very frequent. It was quite easy to measure. You can only just look at the vowel midpoints. You don't have to look at the extra things to make just a usable feature. So it is easy to measure in a way that only the vowel midpoints were doing a good job on their own. Adding the extra things offered some small improvements. Okay, so now moving on to yeah. I used a different data set to look at yeah, partly because a lot of the comments I got during my PhD was that I should be using data that was as close to real forensic data as possible. And this allowed me to look at, rather than controlled experimental data, it looked at some conversational data, but also particularly looked at what is mobile phone recordings. So paired phone conversations. They were all from West Yorkshire, and helpfully someone had already done the work for me to align the phonemes, align each of the sounds using Montreal forced alignment, which means it was already annotated for me. Whereas the previous study, I had to hand annotate and segment everything. And for this study, I looked at yeah against price and face. These are diphthongs, the I and A, diphthong in English. And I looked at an automatic analysis as well, just to see how well the data performs in ASR and how good is this against ASR. We know this will be worse than the automatic method, but how much worse is it going to be? So I took about 500 tokens of yeah from 33 of the speakers, and I measured formant dynamics. So this means measuring 9 measurements across the token, and then I used some stats to kind of reduce that down. So I did a lot of data cleaning. I filtered for any measurements that were problematic. I corrected any jumps across measurement 1, measurement 2, measurement 3, and I calculated some coefficients for it. But dynamic measurements mean that I took 9 measurements across all of the yeah token. So I was still capturing this feature holistically, but I wasn't trying to separate out the yeah from the eh, because that was just too difficult to do. I'm just going to show you visually now what the measurement was like for the vowel. I will show you some formant kind of trajectories in a moment, but the wide range of formant estimates shows like this. So we have yeah overlapping with lots of different vowels. I took about 3 or 4 reference vowels from each speaker. So this is the kind of vowel system for these speakers on average, the whole data set. And every diamond here is a single token of yeah. Sometimes yeah would sound like this.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's quite high in the mouth.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Sometimes it was a bit more open.
Yeah.
Sometimes it was like this.
Yeah.
A bit flatter and less movement as well between across.
Yeah.
That kind of
yeah.
Sometimes it was a bit more of a forceful movement.
Yeah.
Sometimes again a bit like that.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
I occasionally had some tokens that were much more open like this.
Yeah.
Now, all of those different types of yeah were actually from one speaker. So previously I played you the just, and they were all different speakers. This is one person doing a huge range of different types of pronunciations. And that was generally what I found. I'll mention the likelihood ratio results in a moment. I was interested to do a little bit more qualitative analysis here, because as I mentioned, Phil Rose looked at yes, and he found speakers were quite nice and separate there. So here's what the measurements looked like, 9 measurements, and I've represented each of those as a line plot, F1 and F2. So these 2 speakers had the highest and lowest movement for F1. So the highest and lowest kind of yeah or and we can see that these 2 speakers are relatively distinct. So speaker 6 in my data has quite a flat yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. A lot of years together. Speaker 36 tend to have much more movement, and they sounded like this.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
I won't play them all because you get the idea. But there is a lot of movement there between the glide and the vowel. So those two speakers might do something quite separate. And this might be what Phil Rose found in his work, with two speakers doing something quite different.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah. Skip past those. But just selecting another speaker, not quite at random, but just trying to see what does it look like when speakers do overlap. Here's two speakers that were confused with each other in my testing. And we have speaker 38, which has a much more open vowel.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
We have these speakers doing quite distinctive, auditorily slightly distinctive things. So we have this open vowel here.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
You hear some more slight yap there. And on that plot for F1, you see that some of it is a bit more open and some of it is a bit more flat in F2. So there's less movement front to back. But these two speakers were easily confusable in the testing. So the huge amounts of overlap you see there actually made these speakers, this feature was not very good at separating those two people out.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
No more of those. So what do we find for the likelihood ratio results? Well, actually, they were hugely problematic results overall. So problematic results for yeah, but also price and face. And I show the automatic speaker recognition analysis there just to prove that the data wasn't broken. Sometimes you do have poor results for data that is entirely unusable. But here, there seems to be some very problematic results for yeah, but also price and face. This might be to do with the forced alignment. It might also be to do with the granularity of the data. It was messy somewhat on the phone. But yeah, I just want to give you an idea of where yeah would compare with just. I don't do this to show you that this is a great comparison, but just to show you that yeah would be completely off the scale. So yeah is performing very, very, very poorly. It's a different data set, it's different types of measurements, but even so, you would not expect a CLR of over 1. That kind of indicates an error in the data. So yeah is performing very poorly. It's not really offering anything. So yeah is highly frequent. It was very frequent in the data. It was somewhat easy to measure. Although I will say it was quite hard to segment because sometimes yeah was surrounded by vowels and that made it very difficult to say where it began. It performed poorly, very poorly in speaker comparison tests. Two speakers might show some yeah discrimination potential, but overall it's a very poor performance. So a brief summary before I wrap up. Using discourse features is complicated. Yeah was less useful, just as promising. And I just want to touch on the discourse pragmatic aspects of these things. I think it's kind of explainable to think about the different ways that these words are used and how that might impact whether they're useful in forensic comparison. So I looked at yeah in the data I mentioned, but also in a different data set. This was part of a paper looking at generally like and yeah. And I found that when yeah was used in feedback and pre-pausally, so that's me, yeah. Anyway, how are you? It would sound like this.
Yeah, yeah.
So flat, not much movement at all. But when it was used to respond to a question, or when it was used to be incipient, or to take a full turn of speech, are you free? Yeah, I am right now. It would sound like this.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, those were quite consistent, and that was something I found pretty consistently in two sets of data of West Yorkshire.
Yeah, yeah.
Two very different things. Now, with just, the picture was quite different. Discourse just, so when just was used to kind of indicate a minimization, you might see a vowel elided. You might see a dropped t at the end. So it might sound like this.
Oh, I just don't know him, I'm afraid.
Just don't know him. But the vowel would, if it wouldn't be present. So it's not affecting the formants as much.
Oh, I just don't know him, I'm afraid.
Whereas when just was more of an adverb, as in he just started there recently, or that's just down the road, as in relationally, directionally, it might be pronounced like this.
So I just started.
Just started there, or sometimes even just with a t at the end. And those kind of segmental differences were more important than the actual pronunciation of the vowel. So the way yeah is produced depends on function or context. Function affected the vowel in just far less. So this evaluation, you might apply this to a case. If you had a case where the disputed sample, the question sample was full of yeah, that was this kind of feedback yeah, sounded like that. And then in the known sample, you had a lot of yeahs that were responding to questions and they sounded like this.
Yeah.
These are not equivalent. It would be inappropriate to use this two types of yeah to compare across these samples. So comparing yeah with yeah is complicated. There's a need for some functional or contextual equivalence. It's a less consistent feature of speech, so you might need to divide it down into subcategories. Future work might want to look at that and looking at the performance of backchannel yeah against the performance of recipient yeah. I didn't have enough data to look at that, unfortunately. But yeah, so just can be compared with just cross-functionally. And I have a kind of side paper on kind of defining the ways that people use yeah, because it might be that there's another aspect to how speakers use yeah functionally without thinking of the pronunciation. That could be a significant effect. But I thought, particularly in this paper, more about the tagging of the discourse functions rather than the forensic implications. I'm also intrigued to see there's been a little bit of work around fusing the distribution of yeah across the functions, but there's been some work around fusing pronunciations with essentially with the n-grams or with the kind of distribution measures. So this is kind of uniting more forensic linguistic approaches in authorship with this pragmatic variation. I'd be interested to see this done. And I want to say that if just is better than yeah, is it something to do with the function or grammaticalization? So actually, it might be that less discourse-like words could elicit lower within speaker variation. So perhaps rather than looking at discourse features, looking at other features like but, that, was, have, that are more grammatical in function, have less kind of usage, but also are restricted in terms of the context, that is what I would recommend for other frequent features that might be helpful. So to summarize, discourse features can contribute to the toolkit, to the task, with some caveats. Yeah, and other interactional features seem to be actually multiple different phonetic variables within one. Some speakers might use a consistent yeah despite that general trend, but further work is needed to establish the validity of these features. Thank you so much for having me, and I'd welcome any questions.